Podcast news. This is just a quick update on the whole Joe Budden podcast, Rory and Mal podcast saga. So Joe Budden decided to go on to Patreon. Remember, he has that like Patreon deal where he was like the head of creative something or creators' rights or like something like that. But he pretty much put his podcast behind the paywall with Patreon, which some podcasters do. Some podcasters do it exclusively with like Luminary, for example, which is a different service. Some podcasters do it exclusively with Patreon. Some podcasters do it, like Apple now, I think, released like its own paywall type service. Some people do it on their own websites, etc. People do that, right? The model which I like, which seems to make sense to me, which is the direction that I thought Joe Budden was going in, is kind of like a Flagrant 2 model. With their podcast, they're mainly on YouTube and, just audio on, podcatchers, Spotify, Apple, etc. And then they have either an extra show on Patreon for paid subscribers. Tim Dillon does this and many other podcasts do this as well. So their main, bulk of their shows are on YouTube, on all podcatchers, completely for free. And then they give like extra content exclusively on Patreon. And I thought that's what Joe Budden was doing initially, but somewhere along the line, he just moved completely over to Patreon. And then clips of his podcast he was dropping on YouTube. Kind of similar to like how Rogan is exclusively on Spotify, but as part of his deal, even though Spotify didn't want this, Rogan knew like the power of getting eyeballs on your show through YouTube, through clips. So he negotiated the ability to drop clips of the Joe Rogan Experience, even though they're exclusive to Spotify, dropping clips on the Clips channel on YouTube. The idea being that from the hundreds of thousands and millions of views that these clips get on YouTube, it drives traffic towards Spotify. It's like advertising for your show, right? A lot of shows do this, even if they have their show primarily on YouTube, they'll have a separate clips show or a clips channel for their show, so people can stumble upon that and be like, oh shit, I want to go watch like the whole show. And some shows, including my own, for example, you just do that like within your own channel as well. It's different ways to like play around with this stuff. So like I'll take a show and I'll chop it up into different segments and I'll put them all like within my same feed, my same channel. Some people do that. Some people create a whole separate channel just for the clips, etc. So anyway, Joe Budden did that. And again, this is after like the fallout with Rory and Mal. And, Rory and Mal is starting like their own thing. And he went behind Patreon alone. And he was dropping the clips on YouTube. Now, Rory and Mal, during this time, they're putting out their podcast. They're around their like 5th or 6th episode right now. I've watched not all of them, but at least 2 or 3. And I like it. I hope they continue like this momentum. I'm definitely not the only one that likes it. And I'm happy to see and glad to see that they're doing numbers already. Like they have over 200,000 subscribers. Each episode gets like over 500,000 views on YouTube alone, which again, YouTube is a fraction of what podcasts receive via audio listens. So I'm sure they're doing much more than that per episode when you include all, audio podcatching platforms. Again, Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, etc., etc. They're also doing other like creative things, like skits, which are really funny, and I enjoyed. Like the first one that they put out was like them playing on the fact that they got fired from the Joe Budden podcast and like having to like look for a job, and it shows them like going on job interviews and not knowing how to do it and like stuff like that. And it was just like funny. Another one that I saw was Rory on a date, like on a first date with someone, and just like the interaction between them was funny, and I like to see that creativity, and playing around with different things. Now, apparently, Joe Budden's podcast, in terms of like numbers, was slipping, which I don't know. It's kind of like a double-edged sword when you make a move like that, right? When you go to like exclusively behind the paywall, you should expect less because not everybody's going to follow you behind a paywall. But at the same time, from a financial perspective, maybe it makes sense because the people that do follow you are going to make it so that the money they pay to see you behind that paywall is more than you were making on advertising dollars when putting your show out for free on YouTube. But apparently that was the case with Joe Budden's podcast, because now he's switching again to a hybrid model and going back to YouTube. And he's going to have a couple Patreon-only shows per week, a couple of YouTube-only shows per week. The YouTube clips are going to continue even from the Patreon shows on YouTube and kind of do like this like cross-pollination thing, which I think is a better, smarter move. But again, that's just me from the outside looking in. And if he's making that move, apparently it makes dollars and cents as well. Interestingly, DJ Academics was on the Flagrant 2 podcast recently, which is interesting because it's kind of like a merging of these camps, right? It's like you have Flagrant 2, which is obviously a separate entity, but it's co-hosted by Andrew Schultz, which also co-hosts a show called Brilliant Idiots with Charlamagne the God. Charlamagne the God and Joe Budden have had this like feud and beef for some time, as well as, you know, Rory and Mal, which were in that Joe Budden camp before, obviously, like this entire fallout. But then after the fallout, Rory and Mal are recording their show at WTF Studios, which is owned by Wheezy and Alex Media. Alex Media is the producer of and part of the Flagrant 2 podcast. And then DJ Academics was like always had like a beef with Rory and Mal and used to tell Joe Budden that he should like fire them and that they're dead weight, etc. And he's like also cool with Charlamagne. So it's like this weird triangle of like friendships and beefs and podcasts, shit talking back and forth like throughout. But anyway, DJ Academics' take on the situation is that Rory and Mal, the only reason why they're doing numbers is because of the fallout from the Joe Budden podcast, and people kind of like want to see what it is that they're going to do. And I guess that could be part of the case, but not all of it. I mean, they're doing really, really, really good numbers, really strong numbers. And of course, some of it is going to be just from the fallout and people like DJ Academics thinks, you know, just wanting to see what's up. What are these guys going to do now? Let's go see, you know, what they talk about. And people just like into like the gossip side of shit. But it can't all be that. And the same could be said on the flip side. The reason why Joe's numbers are flipping are because people left and are now with the Rory and Mal quote unquote camp or whatever and don't want to fuck with Joe anymore. And the Joe Budden podcast worked because of the chemistry of them three on that show, as I've said so myself. But does that mean that the Joe Budden podcast can't build up and, you know, continue the momentum that it had before? Eventually, no, of course not. Like, it'll continue to grow and do its thing, I'm sure. And they're not like mutually exclusive things. I don't know. I just want to see them all win, all do well, all do good, all continue to grind and put out content. Hopefully Rory and Mal stay consistent. Hopefully Joe Budden figures out exactly where to land and how he wants to proceed with his show. And hopefully all of them stay consistent in what they're doing and putting out content for us to enjoy and consume. And the last very quick unrelated aside related to podcast news is that Jiosaavn and GAN, Gaan, are two services, podcasting services, which are the most popular in India. India has a rising podcast interest population or listenership, and the main services that they use are those. Jiosaavn, Giovaan, I believe it's spelled, and GAN, Gaan. I believe Jiosaavn's like numbers are like 58 million regular like listenership and rising. And to get your podcast on there, you would have to like submit for it. Similar to all other podcasters, like most podcasts that are like wide, like this one, like the Spun Today Podcast, for example, where I go on to any and all services possible. You know, I'm not like exclusive with Spotify or something like that. Most, I would say like 85, 90% just pull from shows that are already on Apple. So if there's a new podcatcher that pops up, odds are you'll be on it because they pull all the shows that are on Apple. So if you're on Apple, you're good. But again, that's for 85, 90% of the podcatchers that are out there. Like the TuneIns and iHeart, Crowdcast, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in a case for the other like 10, 15%, and this is where Jiosaavn falls in, you have to like physically submit to have your podcast ported over there. So you have to get, you know, fill out like a quick form on their website and give your like your podcast name, description, the RSS feed, your email, and then in like 24 to 72 hours they like approve you, and then all your shows are now available there, which you're exposing yourself to 58 million plus and counting folks that are just getting into podcasts. And why not? You know, why exclude yourself from the conversation when you don't have to? So those podcasters of you out there, definitely check that out if you're interested. I'll link to Jiosaavn specifically within the episode notes.